Hello and welcome to Global News Today. I'm Micheál Prendergast, and coming up on today's show, Russia launches its largest aerial assault on Ukraine since the war began. Plus, we'll turn to the US for a roundup of the latest news on the ground with Angie Wong. Welcome to the show. As Russia ramps up its war with Ukraine with a massive drone strike in Kiev, President Trump has called for tougher sanctions on Russia and an increase in NATO spending. Well, joining me to discuss this further is Lord Dannatt, the former head of the British Army. Lord Dannatt, thank you so much for your time. What message do you think Russia is trying to send with this record drone strike on Kiev?
The message that is coming out of the Kremlin is, well, you might be talking about wanting to make peace in Ukraine, and Mr. Trump, you might be talking about it, and European leaders might be talking about it, but frankly, here in the Kremlin, we're not really interested. We will continue with what we've called our special military operation, and we believe we're succeeding. We've got no interest in peace at the present moment. I think that's the message that's coming out of the Kremlin, disappointingly, at the present time. President
Trump's threat of further sanctions. We've seen a lot of sanctions over the past few years. Is this able to realistically change Vladimir Putin's plans for Ukraine?
Well, I think this is the problem that Donald Trump has now got. I mean, he reached out 2 or 3 weeks ago and they had that summit. And the two leaders were pictured across the world of speaking together. But since then, we don't really see any signs of peace coming out of Russia. And Donald Trump has got now to find ways of putting more pressure on Russia. And there have always been more sanctions that could be applied. And I think Donald Trump has now got to decide, well, as much as he would like to try and show that he can do a deal with Vladimir Putin, he can get on well with Vladimir Putin, what he would like to show. But he may have to reluctantly decide that actually, to use his own words, Putin is tapping him along, and that he may have to toughen up, put more sanctions, and support the Ukrainians even more, and support the Europeans in their planning for whatever might follow by way of a ceasefire. So I think Donald Trump is having to reluctantly realize that his overtures to Putin are being rejected. Every time they have a conversation, it seems that there's another major airstrike on Kyiv or other parts of Ukraine.
There's been a lot of talk as well of a peacekeeping force on the ground. Is this feasible in your mind?
Well, there's talk about all kinds of measures being considered after a ceasefire. And of course, that phrase, after a ceasefire, is absolutely material. There's no way that anything could be done by international forces on the ground ahead of a ceasefire. And begs the question, we were talking about it just now, do we see any prospects for a ceasefire? Well, at the present moment, I don't. However, what's going on in the meantime is a coalition of nations that are willing to participate in peace arrangements, getting on and planning together. The military is good at planning, and various contingency plans are being put together, which might be put into place after a ceasefire. But again, I come back to what I said just now. Nothing can happen until there is a ceasefire. And I can't see any circumstances at the present moment when Vladimir Putin will be willing to have a ceasefire, despite the fact that Trump is calling for one.
We saw Putin, along with Xi and Kim Jong-un in China for the World War II anniversary. What did you make of their military parade?
Well, it was very impressive, and it was designed to be impressive. It was designed particularly to show non-aligned countries that there is an alternative to the West, the world, the West being led by America. What they were trying to show from Beijing was that a combination of China, Russia, and to an extent North Korea is an alternative to an American-led world. The military power on display was very impressive. But I think we mustn't discount the fact that this is another significant global bloc that is being put together, is being strengthened as China's economy is strengthening, as its military is being increased, that this is an alternative bloc of power to an American Trump-led West.
And as you stated, it was impressive. It drew a lot of praise online. Does this reinforce President Trump's idea that the West must up their military spending?
Well, of course, this is absolutely the case. Unless the West, under US leadership, wants to quietly accept second fiddle in the world, then we have to increase our defence spending, increase our defence capability. Not that we want to be better able to fight a war, but to show that we can talk from a position of strength to deter further incursions in Europe by Russia, further adventures by China in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, there's been a lot of focus on whether China might move against Taiwan. Well, this is always possible. And if China thinks that America is weak, that American security guarantees to Taiwan, to the Philippines, to South Korea, to Japan are not really to be taken seriously, then it increases the possibility of China deciding to move rapidly against Taiwan. So the West has to look seriously at its military capability, look at the amount of money that it's spending on it, and as most sensible commentators are saying and have been saying for some time, we need to increase our defence budgets to increase our defensive deterrent capability.
And as it stands at Lord Dannatt, would the West be able to defend Taiwan against a Chinese attack?
Well, that is an extraordinarily good question. There is no doubt that the Chinese military is very powerful. It's obviously much more significant than the Taiwanese military capability. It begs the question, the extent to which America would be prepared to put its military might at the behest of Taiwan and risk being involved in a very serious, effectively a war with China. Most sensible people, most rational people wouldn't want to see this. So this comes back to the whole question of deterrence and security guarantees, which is why it's really important the United States shows that it's strong in the Indo-Pacific area, is prepared to honor its security guarantees to Taiwan, to South Korea, to the Philippines, and to Japan, and to make the Chinese leadership think again. Now, there is a school of thought which I understand that if the Chinese are prepared to be patient, there is quite a proportion of the Taiwanese population that would probably prefer to be linked to mainland China and not for Taiwan to remain independent. So it could well be that if China is prepared to play a long game, Taiwan might at some point drop into its lap without having to fight for it. Now that's a matter for the Taiwanese people on a democratic basis, but it would be infinitely preferable for the status quo to remain, for America to show that it is strong enough to deter Chinese aggression, and for the Chinese to be sensible enough not to risk it.
And moving back to the question of military spending, what has been your impression of President Trump's methods in regards to cajoling, if you will, or harassing NATO members in order to increase their military spending?
Well, he's been effective as far as that's concerned, and most people would agree this is not unreasonable. For too long since the end of the Cold War, European countries have been prepared to shelter not just under the United States nuclear umbrella, but to a large extent under the United States conventional capability umbrella. And for nations a few years ago to be spending less than 2% of their GDP on defense, when America was spending much more, and part of that was for the security of Europe, it's not unreasonable that Trump has been cajoling, persuading, arguing the case that European countries should spend more. Now, at the last NATO summit, commitments were made that countries like the United Kingdom would move towards 3.5% of GDP to be spent on hard power, and up to 5% of GDP on defence and security related matters. Now that's quite a significant increase for the United Kingdom from the somewhere between 2.3 and 2.5% of what we spend now, effectively doubling that. But Trump is not wrong to say, come on, you Europeans, you can't rely on the United States to look after your security. You've got to do it yourself. Your economies are large enough. You can afford to do this. Now get on and do it. And I think of the many things that he's done and said, that is the most sensible, unwelcome in many European countries, but he's right. And European countries have got to step up to the plate, find the cash, and increase defence capability to deter further aggression from Russia.
And I'd like to pick your brain on a question. Is it ever a size of quality over quality? I've seen an interview done by a UK Army, British Army captain, who spoke about you could fit the entirety of the British Army into Wembley Stadium. It holds about 90,000. How big was the army when you first joined?
Well, the army when I first joined in the late 60s was somewhere over 150,000, of which more than 50,000 were stationed in what was then West Germany as part of the West's deterrent force during the Cold War. Now, a lot changed when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989 and the Soviet Union disappeared. The Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union's armed forces crumbled, and many countries took successive peace dividends, and it's meant that the British Army has gone from when I joined over 150,000 now to somewhere around 75,000. Yes, it would fill Wembley Stadium with a few seats left over. Now those are judgments that politicians have made over the years, but there are now a realization that the world is not as secure as we would have wished it to be. There are threats to our security from China in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East. We've seen that from Iran through Hamas and Hezbollah being combated by Israel, and then in Europe from Russia. So there's a very strong case now that European countries should be increasing their defence expenditure in order to maintain their own security and deter further aggression.
And is it merely fantasy, the idea of conscription could ever rear its head in Europe again? We've seen the president of Latvia, he called for that over the summer. I'd like your take on that.
Well, countries in Europe have had a different tradition of conscription and national service. For most of the Cold War, many of the European countries continued to have conscription and a form of national service. Now, the United Kingdom doesn't have a tradition of national service. We had it for about 14 years between 1949 and 1963, apart from the days of the First and the Second World War. But if there is going to be a requirement for greater numbers in the armed forces of European countries, then governments have got to think about how they're going to find that manpower. Now, you can do it through market forces. You can put pay and conditions up to make it attractive for people to think they would like to have a career in the military. Or if that is not possible, or if that's not going to work, then some form of collective conscription on a quota basis may have to be considered. I think other countries other than the United Kingdom might go down that track sooner. Probably those countries that have a close border, like the Baltic states and Poland, with Russia. It's something the British government will have to consider, but I don't see a decision for conscription and national service in the United Kingdom coming anytime soon.
And how about national service? We're seeing a huge shortfall in the amount of people even available, even not for armed forces, to work in hospitals as porters. There's also a lot that I imagine, and you'll attest to, that you can learn in the army, regimen, discipline, etc. What are your thoughts on return of national service?
Well, if I've been asked that question once in the last 25 years, I've probably been asked it dozens of times. There is no doubt, if you talk to the former national service generation, that they will say that those days were amongst the best days of their life. They learnt how to live with other people. They travelled to interesting places. They knew how to respect discipline. They knew how to work properly. And that was a good contribution to the national workforce. But, you know, it's not the business of the armed forces to educate the national population. This is something for the Department of Education to do. It's something for commercial companies to do. So as much as people might like the benefits that came from national service, I think we're quite a long way from that. And anyway, the infrastructure required of having training depots and training camps up and down the country, that just doesn't exist anymore. Those bases have been closed during the 30-odd years of peace since the end of the Cold War. So it's one thing to talk about it, quite another thing to do it, quite another thing to afford it. And I think that if there was to be any form of return to national service, because we need more soldiers, sailors, airmen and Marines, it would be on a selective quota basis. But I think, as I said just now, in the United Kingdom, I think we're some way away from that still.
Just lastly, Lord Dannatt, we're going to turn to domestic matters within the UK. There's been a lot of talk of the Home Office that they would like to make use of the UK's, as you said, the lesser used army bases to house asylum seekers. What's your take on this?
Well, we've done that in the past, but it's related to what I was saying just now in the context of national service. There is not a large number of surplus and empty military bases up and down the country. As we've reduced the size of our armed forces, we've reduced the size of the defence estate. We've sold off housing and barracks and to an extent training areas. So there is some capacity, but there's not a huge amount of capacity. I think the government is going to have to be more imaginative, possibly buying up land, erecting temporary accommodation. There aren't a large number of empty barracks just sitting there waiting to be filled up by migrants. When we reduced from 50,000 troops in Germany to 0, those barracks all became available to the German government, and we didn't have the equivalent number of spare barracks in the United Kingdom.
We're just out of time. Lord Dannatt, thanks so much for your time. Now let's move stateside for a full debrief on the latest and greatest news lines that are coming out of the United States with Angie Wong, a Republican strategist who's based in Miami, Florida. Thanks so much for your time, Angie. I'd like to start off, after Russia's massive drone attack, what has been the response from the White House?
Yeah, certainly the U.S. and the White House has been watching very closely the 800 drones that had struck Ukraine over the last evening, and including a government building. And that was the first time that has happened. We're learning now that a lot of the drones had dummy heads, meaning that they weren't carrying weapons, but they were certainly guided. So President Trump had set a deadline for Putin to come and do a bilateral meeting with Zelensky. That deadline had passed last week, and President Trump has largely been quiet. But we are now hearing from the White House that President Trump is ready to put more sanctions on Putin. It seems as though President Trump has finally lost patience with Putin after rolling out the red carpet for him in Alaska. So we will see this week what type of sanctions President Trump is going to be rolling out. We're hearing some murmurs of hitting and freezing the bank accounts for various oligarchs here in the U.S. Those are the jurisdictions that we can control, and really getting to the center of Russia's power class. But we'll see what other sanctions can be afforded at this time. There were also some talks about stopping ghost ships that is carrying Russian crude oil to various parts of the world. Again, all options are on the table for President Trump. We'll see how far he goes with this.
There's been sanctions for years now. It seems that the Russian economy it has fared extremely well. Are further sanctions going to have any impact at all?
Yeah, and well, the latest one was secondary tariffs to India, and Prime Minister Modi of India basically went over into the arms of Putin and Xi, as we saw evident in last week's SCO meeting. And it's forming a very, very strange ally of Putin and Xi, Modi, and others. And I think President Trump is watching that very carefully. In the background, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, along with Jameson Greer, tried to do a deal with Modi. And President Trump said no deal until they stop buying Russian crude oil. So these are hardliners. President Trump is examining all options right now, because what we don't want is a new axis of evil being formed between Putin, Xi, and Modi. And I think that is what's, his tariffs on India has definitely pushed them all together. So I think President Trump is learning pretty quickly that these tariffs, this kind of American cowboy way of managing these tariffs may not be working for all parts of the world. And he's certainly scaled back quite a bit. And I think he's recalibrating this week.
With Trump being critical of NATO, how important are his European allies now?
I think President Trump was really hoping that NATO and EU leaders would step up and help Ukraine so that the U.S. does not have to get involved, certainly with any troops on the ground. I think that is a hard no for President Trump, is not to commit any sort of U.S. troops into this war. NATO and EU, obviously, they were invited to the White House following the Alaska summit between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. And it looked great, certainly for the cameras, but at the end of the day, not much was done. Last week, some of the countries in the EU have pledged peace troops to go into helping secure the Ukraine-Russia border, but only post-war. So we have to get there first. Right now is what can we do to get Putin to the table to meet with Zelensky? And of course, Putin had teased, I'm happy to meet Zelensky, but in Moscow. And of course, Zelensky's not happy about that, and he's counter-proposing to meet somewhere else. So right now, it's a war of words. Putin is going to continue bombing Ukraine, and I think that is where we are right now. It is a very, very hard line. Putin wants to get into Ukraine and wants to take his territories, if not more. And it doesn't appear as though NATO or EU leaders are doing anything very, very proactive about it. They're waiting for Trump's instructions. So I think that's where Trump is right now. He's either going to pivot or he's going to double down. But right now, additional sanctions are on the table. He's already warned Putin that that's going to happen. But whether or not that's going to be enough to actually move Putin to stop, no one knows.
Moving on to domestic matters in the United States, over 300 South Koreans were detained at a raid at a Hyundai plant. What do you make of this case?
You know, it's a very interesting case because President Trump has taken a very different tone in this ICE raid versus other ICE raids. This one is much less harsh, and it's because a lot of it's wrapped up in politics. Remember, the South Korean president, President Lee, had just visited the White House 2 weeks ago. During those discussions at the White House, President Lee had committed a $150 billion investment in the U.S., especially in its shipping industries, and in trade of a reduction of U.S. tariffs to 15%. After the raid of about 300 illegal migrants working in Georgia at the Hyundai factory, that investment all of a sudden jumped up to $350 billion. So, I don't know if that was already in place or maybe that was on the higher end of their negotiations 2 weeks ago. This has certainly been, I'm not saying it's a negotiation tactic, but that is what has happened. It's a very calm and deal-making Trump that South Korea is dealing with versus kind of the harsher Tom Holman style negotiations on the other side with other illegal crossings where, detainees are just getting shipped back or they're getting sent to Alligator, Alcatraz, and things like that. This one is done a lot more peacefully, and Trump has changed his tone. He has said, maybe we do need to train Americans to work in these factories. Maybe we need that versus just bringing in illegals and having them overstay their visas.
And it's obviously clear Trump is trying to send a message. If you're an illegal immigrant in America and you're caught working, you will be deported.
Yes, and I hope all American companies and companies working in America will respect our immigration laws. You have to have legal documentation to work here in the U.S. Those companies who have the laws for many, many years, they're getting caught out. And there are going to be ICE raids around the country because of it. So this was a very important lesson for all companies who are hosting and paying for illegal migrants working here illegally. Trump has given Hyundai its own self-audit. It's time to self-correct. And hopefully there are no fines going to Hyundai. And maybe that's where the additional amounts of U.S. investments is coming in, because I'm sure South Korea knows that it will please Trump, and maybe it will have less harsh repercussions because of it. But it is a very different tone that Trump is taking here, only because they're wrapped up in negotiation right now for a U.S. trade deal. And I do hope that other countries are watching this episode saying, okay, well, maybe we have to get rid of the illegal migrants before ICE comes in. It's a very bad look for the company.
President Trump has stated that foreign firms in America, they must hire American workers. Is this realistic?
It absolutely is realistic. I mean, I know we have some training to make up and our industries are modernizing, but those are the laws. I could not go to Rome and just start working for an Italian company just because I feel like it as an American. You know, there are procedures to all this. If not, everyone can come in and start working in American companies. I feel protected as an American that my workplace will be filled with Americans who are paying American tax dollars, right? That's the other thing that, you know, doesn't get touched on. A lot of the illegals here, well, they don't necessarily pay taxes, but yet they benefit from all the American benefits of taxpayers. So I, for one, I'm happy to see it happening. I'm surprised at the numbers, and I'm surprised for a major company like Honda to actually employ illegals, as much as 300 illegals. Remember, 475 people were arrested at the Hyundai factory over the weekend. That's quite a bit of the workforce. I don't know how large their entire workforce is, but that's a good percentage. And, you know, I think this should be a warning call to all American companies hosting illegals.
Moving on to a tragic story in America now. A Ukrainian refugee was stabbed to death on a train. This has got a huge amount of coverage over the past few days. What's been your reaction?
Oh, it's been the most senseless murder, and it was so horrible to watch, especially since it was captured on video and went viral. I'm happy to hear that Representative Randy Fine and other congressional members are now penning a bill that will hold judges accountable for releasing these repeat offenders. The accused murderer has been released out of prison 14 times and let back into society and onto our streets to create more harm, in this case, murdering someone senselessly. So I think it's a time that America has a really hard look at repeat offenders, because we're letting them out and hoping that they will self-correct, that they will no longer harm if they were given a 15th chance. This case should never have happened, and it's completely senseless. I'm just happy to see our congressional members do something about it.
We've seen this a lot in the West. It's happened in the UK, it's happened all over Europe, and it's happening in America. Recurring felons being released. This is just a failure by the state to protect the citizens.
That is correct. I mean, public safety, if nothing else, should be what elected officials do. And our judges here, as well as our elected officials, are championing the criminals, and they're protecting the criminals and trying to rehabilitate them versus maybe just the harsher punishment, which is to lock them up. I personally would like to see the media publish the names of the judges that allowed this guy to come out onto the streets 14 times after horrible crimes that he's committed. But there is a huge problem. I think the focus has to be on repeat offenders. Some people cannot be rehabilitated. They have to be locked up. President Trump just last week was talking about reopening insane asylums, something that we haven't spoken about since the 1980s when Ronald Reagan shut them down. But maybe it's time to do that, because clearly not only was this a violent act, it was also a mental health issue. And I think a lot of people are, whether they're full-on criminals or halfway in between, they need help. And there's nowhere to seek help. And unfortunately, a lot of them live on subways and on public transport, and they commit crimes because they can't help themselves. So please take them off our streets. Please make everyone safe. If nothing else, that's what elected officials have to do.
And Sean Duffy, the US Transport Secretary, again, to touch on a point that you touched on, he's blamed the local officials for not acting sooner. Surely the burden of responsibility is on them.
That's right. And the mayor of Charlotte, where this incident occurred, had come out looking for reforms and for, for feel-good clemency on this guy who murdered someone cold-heartedly. And there's even a GoFundMe account set up to help the murderer or the alleged murderer. And it's not, it's one of those things where I think it's a little bit backwards when clearly the public sees this is happening. It's very, very dangerous. Many people were even blaming the victim for sitting in front of him without having her eyes on a potential predator. I mean, this is not the victim's fault whatsoever. She just got on a train and she was minding her own business. But this is where we are in a society. To me, these are all just talking points from the left because the reality is we're not safe on our streets and we do need to do something about it. It does take moments like this for things to change. So I'm very happy to see various congressional members penning a bill as we speak to hold those accountable.
And speaking about safety on the streets of America, we've seen Donald Trump put the National Guard into Washington, which has had a huge impact. As he said, crime has dropped by over 90%. How concerned are average Americans about crimes in cities like DC, New York, LA?
Yes, residents are very happy to see National Guard on our streets protecting its citizens. A lot of these cities that President Trump are going into, they've had their police budgets slashed, or police freezes on hiring. And there's been a lot of anti-cop rhetoric over the years, especially in these blue cities. So for the first time, we're welcoming the National Guard. Now, remember, National Guard does not have any arresting powers. All they can do is facilitate the local police there. So I think a lot of this scare and fear mongering coming from the left is not justified because the National Guard are really there just to patrol and to be deterrents. And if needed, they can assist with arrests, but they cannot actually arrest any perpetrators themselves. So, as someone who's not committing crimes, just walking down the street, I personally welcome them, especially seeing them in the subways late at night and things like that. And I know there's been a lot of pushback. Mayor Johnson of Chicago has even signed an executive order ordering his local police, the Chicago police, to not work with federal law enforcement. In Chicago, that's going to be a catch-22 because law enforcement is not going to fight law enforcement. And what Chicago has done over the weekend is to call their proxy armies of protesters to come out. And the reason why I say it's a catch-22 is because if these protesters actually got violent or somehow intruded into public safety, guess what? That gives President Trump justification to bring in the National Guard into Chicago. That didn't happen, but maybe it might happen in other cities.
And just lastly, speaking about blue cities, what do you make of Bernie Sanders, who's backed Zohran Mamdani, obviously the presidential hopeful in New York? He also met with AOC.
That's right. They met in Astoria, Queens over the weekend. Look, it was three billionaires talking about socialism over the weekend in Queens. I just found that photo op to be very, very funny. Here's the truth, New York. You're likely going to get a Mamdani mayor in November. Polly Market has a Mamdani win at 82%, and that was a mid-July poll that was taken. I'm a little bit nervous about it, but at the same time, I realize that if it's going to be AOC, Bernie Sanders, Mamdani heading the Democratic Party, well, that's going to be an easy win for Republicans in 2026 and 28. These three characters, they are the face of the Democrat Party right now. And I think that for the Democratic Party to take on three socialists, that is not the direction of this country. We are a capitalist society. We love the American dream. We do not want a command economy. So I think that this is going to be easier for Republicans to take back all the houses and local seats because of three socialists running the Democrat line.
We're just out of time. Angie Wong, the Republican strategist, thanks so much for your time.